So welcome to our presentation about the CDP-Driver connection mode, which is a new connection mode of QFTest, which you probably have heard about when you've read the release notes of our latest release 5.3, where it says CDP connection mode everywhere, and probably have thought about what is in fact a connection mode and why does it concern me, and is it something I have to be happy about? Is it some great feature, or is it something which I shouldn't be interested in because it's just under the hood? Well, with this webinar today, I try to explain that a little bit. I try to get you on the line to see whether the connection mode, what is the connection mode, whether you have to use it or not, whether it's good for you to use it or not, what are your advantages when using the CDP driver connection mode, and then what happens with your special solutions which you might have in your tests. How do they how do the switch to a CDP driver connection mode probably impact the execution of these special solutions? So let us first have a look on what is meant by connection mode. So what is in fact the CDP driver connection mode? To have it very, very dense and shortly, it's an option in the drop-down box you have next to the, when you select the Start Web Engine node in your test. So if you execute web tests, you have a startup sequence probably generated from the quick start wizard, or you generated yourself and you adapted it. And at some point, the system under test is started with the Start Web Engine step. And there you have this drop-down box where it says browser connection mode, and you have more or less 3x2 options, 3 different drivers where you can select whether you really want to ensure that your test is executed with this driver in this connection mode, or whether you just say, well, I prefer to have it executed that way, but if it's not possible, use another good way. This is the very short explanation of what you see of the connection mode, but maybe you're a little bit interested in the insight, so I have prepared some little explanation of that. When we started web testing in 2008, there was just the one and only connection mode, which is the QFDriver, which we called later QFDriver. And in this mode, we have a browser started with a web engine where you execute your tests in. And you probably have wondered that the browser looks a little bit different from the one you installed. Or you, for example, installed a Chrome, let's say 91, and then when you start the web browser from QFTest, it says it's starting Chrome 89, but you never installed some Chrome 89. So the big question is, why does this happen? And the answer is we integrate the browsers very, very dense with QFTest. So in fact, we implemented a solution where we embed the browser which you like to execute inside QFTest. So we have access to all the stuff which the browser renders, which the browser has internally. And we can include this in our tests, and we can access them, for example, access all the nodes, capture all the events the browser is generating. And this works pretty fine for Chrome. Under Windows, there is no implementation currently for using QFDriver with Chrome on Linux machines or macOS. It works well with the Internet Explorer, where it embeds the Internet Explorer installed on your system, but probably you've heard that Internet Explorer is going to be removed at some point in the future from Windows. So probably this is not the target of new tests anymore. And it works well with Firefox on Linux and on Windows if you want to test Firefox up to version 43. Because then Firefox developers said that they restructure the complete browser. They make it faster, they make it quicker, they make it shiny, and they drop the embedding support, which is pretty bad for the QFDriver because without an embedding, we have no chance to put a newer Firefox inside our frame. So to access all the information from that. And with that future on the horizon, we asked ourselves, what can we do? How can we access new Firefox versions and the content of newer Firefox versions from QFTest? Because we know that Firefox is an important feature for a lot of customers, and they want to use new Firefoxes with QFTest. So what we came up with was a solution to use the public WebDriver standard protocol, which is certified by the W3C gremium consortium, and they specified a protocol on how to remote control browsers in general for testing. And it's a great protocol if you want to execute tests on any website you know beforehand, and if you just want to issue commands on that website, and then, for example, ask questions on the website like, what is the color of this button? Or with this XPath, I want to select an element, and then I want to emit a click on it on something like this. And what QFTest does from version 4.1, which was released a couple of 5 years ago, we embed a WebDriver library. Since QFTest itself runs in Java, we embedded a Java library called Selenium, which is open source, and use this library to talk the WebDriver API protocol, which then in turn connects to a driver, which is browser related. So this is, for example, the Chrome driver, or the MS Edge driver, or the Opera driver, or for Firefox, the Gecko driver, or for Safari, the Safari driver. Which in turn, on the one side, speaks the one protocol, which is the same for all the systems, the browsers, and on the other side speaks some browser native protocol, like a development protocol, a debugging protocol, or for Firefox, the Marionette protocol. And with that, on that side, can control the browser. Which is great, because now we can control from QFTest side a wide variety of browsers, like the Firefox versions, current Firefox versions, all the Chrome versions, where there is a driver for, well, you need a special driver for every browser and every version, more or less. So that means QFTest is intelligent enough to find out which version of browser you want to test, and then dynamically download, for example, the Chrome driver or the Edge or Opera driver for this specific version of browsers. So you don't have to bother with updating them manually if you have an internet connection. If you don't have, because you're in a firewall situation, you have to care yourself about when you update the Chrome, which happens like every 6 weeks, you have to update the corresponding drivers. Anyway, we can connect to that. We can even connect to the old Edge if there is some old Edge in your testing requirements. We can connect to Opera, the new Edge, and to Safari. But as you're experienced that you want to interact very, very densely with the browser. So QFTest should be able to, for example, record any events you issue, like the clicks or the typing of keys when you enter data in text elements. And for that, we needed some kind of way back from the browser to QFTest. And this is kind of a problem, because the WebDriver specification doesn't specify any bidirectional communication. So it is great to communicate in one direction, and then you get some value back. But there is no way for a browser to say, well, there was some interesting event, and I want to inform, let's say, QFTest about this interesting click or this interesting page reload or whatever happens in the browser. Request for authentication or so and so on. So we worked around that problem, defining our own back channel, which works in a great way. So in the most times, you were able to execute the tests which you beforehand, for example, executed on Firefox 43 with QFDriver, now with the WebDriver on a Firefox, recent Firefox, like whatever it is, 89, 90, or whatever. With some limitations. For example, speed might not be as fast as it was before, because there is a lot of communication overhead when using the WebDriver protocol and the drivers and the back channel, which we have to compensate somehow. But with all these overhead, you never get the same speeds as you could have with the dense integration we have with QFDriver, where we really can access the interesting data in memory at no time. So we thought about, how could we get around that problem? How could we integrate really densely with the browser again? How can we get rid of all the extra steps for different browser versions, and then first convert everything to WebDriver, then convert everything to a development protocol? And what we came up with is using directly the development protocol offered by, for example, in this case, Chromium, which is called the CDP, the Chrome DevTools protocol. and which allows us to control any browser implementing this protocol, which at the current time are all the Chromium-based browsers. This is Google Chrome, this is Microsoft Edge, this is Opera, and a number of other browsers which we don't officially support, which work now as well, and which will also be a Firefox in future, because the Mozilla team is about to implement this CDP protocol as kind of a generic remote protocol to control as well Firefox. But unfortunately, this implementation is not finished yet and is not yet fully compliant to the specification. Well, that's the reason why QFTest 5.3 not yet supports Firefox in that mode, but in future it will be. So let's first, just as a background information, have a look at what this Chrome DevTool protocol is about. And the easiest way to look at that is to switch to a Chromium browser, which I already opened here. And when you then show the development tools, so some of you might have already done this because they wanted to inspect the DOM tree, or they wanted to look what is the current style of an element or something like this. And you have all the information here. You have all the styles, and you have all the DOM nodes of the page. And what happens in the background, and you can enable this with a debug experimental feature in the DevTools, that the DevTool part, which is here on the right side, communicates with the browser, which is in this case on the left side, but which can be another process. It communicates using WebSocket, and as you can see here on the bottom, it sends commands to this other browser window and then gets events. For example, when something happens, we can issue events, and QFTest now uses this dense and bidirectional WebSocket-based protocol to communicate with the browser. So in fact, that's all about CDP. That's the interesting stuff. What's saying, normally you shouldn't have to bother with that at all. It's everything under the hood. If you don't, we can more or less do now everything which you could do with the DevTools from QFTest side. So if you require this, there is a way to integrate with all the stuff the DevTools do. But on the other hand, you will see that that just switching to the CDP will be an enormous advantage for your tests. So how does it look like? How do you switch to CDP? I've already said you probably have in your tests a browser start sequence. I have one here. And there inside is some step called the start web engine. Here it is. And there we have the browser connection mode drop-down box. And by default, nothing is written inside. So it says, well, use the best way you know, which on my system, because it's a macOS system, would be now with the Chrome browser, the CDP mode. So if I want to start this in CDP mode, I don't have to do anything. I just can run the sequence and it will start up in CDP. It's the same way as if I would select here, prefer CDP-Driver, which would then say, okay, for all browsers, use the CDP-Driver when you can, otherwise fall back to WebDriver, which is at the moment Firefox and Safari. So when we start this, and don't bother about the logging, I have activated more logging than you usually have on your system. Well, it started up the browser, and it started up, shows our web page, and I could now record everything here as I would do that with the other connection modes, and in fact, you don't see any difference. So you now again have the question, why should I switch? Well, one thing you didn't see here is that it was downloading some Chrome driver, and that it installed some Chrome driver, and that it adapts to the version number, because we don't need that anymore. And there are other cool features too, which you just get when you switch to the CDP mode instead of the WebDriver mode. So you've seen we also propose that you use the connection mode as a variable. So I prepared that with our car config demo. I prepared here the connection mode. I set it to WebDriver, which is like the alternative to CDP for the current Chromes, if you want to run them as individual processes. And I just start up one of the test cases here. Probably you know that because you already used our demo, which we supply with QFTest, and it's some kind of car configurator where you can select some car and then select some options for it, and then it tests that there's the correct price, and that works pretty fast. So, it now always selects the vehicle and then in a loop selects next specials and then selects accessories and then checks that the price is okay, and this runs in a loop. So it looks like it's doing everything all the time the same thing, but in fact it's iterating over the different cars and different specials. And this means that it's faster than I could click with my mouse, so it's already faster than doing that manually, but well, you can look at it and it takes some time. And when you execute the same test in QFDriver, it's a little bit faster because, as I said, we don't have the protocol overhead there. So when I look at my controls, it took about like 56 seconds. You can remove the 5 seconds from the beginning because there's a splash screen saying nothing in the beginning, just to show the nice logo of QFTest. And well, let's see what's happening when we switch to CDP-Driver. And I promise you there still will be the 5 seconds in the beginning because it's hard-coded. So you can enjoy our splash screen. Here it is. And then it starts the same sequence as before. I didn't change anything in the test. And as you can see, it's faster. And for a lot of web tests, that's an issue because web tests take some time. You have to load the page has to adapt, you have to issue the events, you have to synchronize to the events, you have to check that the browser has already consumed the event before you execute the next click. Well, it's already done. Wow. So let's have a look on how long the test ran. Oh, it's just 31 seconds. So we have half the time than before just by changing from WebDriver to CDP-Driver. That's really cool. And that's one of the big issues, one of the big advantages when you change to CDP-Driver instead of WebDriver. So when you've said, okay, my requirement is, for example, MS Edge, where there is no QFDriver, which you can now as well, by the way, test under Linux because there is an MS Edge for Linux. You could test the current Chromes on Linux with the CDP driver. You don't have to fall back to WebDriver. That means in your Docker container, for example, you can now specify CDP instead of WebDriver when testing the Chrome. And there are other features. For example, the feature of file up and download. People know that it's really easy to do that with the QFDriver mode, but when you switch to WebDriver for some reason or another, well, you were a little bit dissatisfied because you had to write some scripts like that one, where you specify some preferences for Firefox that you say, okay, let's do all downloads to some folder, and then let's check whether there is some file in the folder and so on. And even worse with file uploads, you sometimes had to write scripts like these, where you search for a window with a Windows API, and then you get that window in the foreground, and then you have to find child windows and so on. You don't want to read that a lot out. It just works on Windows, and if the focus isn't on the correct page, it doesn't work at all. And there's the alternative, which is the way specified by the WebDriver protocol, that you send some input key sequence to the file upload element, which is not really what people do when they interact with it, like as users. So it doesn't look natural. And the good news is with CDP, you don't need that. So I just start up my browser again so I can demonstrate that. So here it is. For file download, I go to a download test page. Here I have some file downloads. And when I want to put some file download here in my test case, I just record that. I say, okay, let's download that one. It asks me where to store. Well, let's store that in my home directory. And that's it. I recorded here the sequence. It says, click on the link, wait for the download dialog to come up, select some, put some value in the download dialog, and then wait for the download to finish. That's the same sequence, by the way, you get when you execute that and record that with QFDriver. So if you have at the moment QFDriver, but you say, well, I want to test with the latest Edge, I wanted to test it with the latest Chrome, I just download the Chromium 93, which is the build from 20 minutes ago, and I want to use that for my test, that's fine with CDP. Sometimes the CDP protocol changes. By the way, it changes very often, but it normally doesn't change in the main parts which we use for QFTest. So we've made good experiences about using the CDP mode, even with cutting edge versions. which and it will work with the released versions as soon as they are released. There is a QFTest version which works guaranteed with that Chrome version, which is like every 6 weeks there will be a new one. But by the way, they can interchange that with QFDriver one-to-one. And the same is true for uploading. I have made another demo here. It asks for some upload file. Okay, let's record that. I want to choose a file. It shows some file selection. I select a file. I say, okay, I want to submit that. It's, by the way, the file we just downloaded. It has 1, 2, 3 in it. It just displays that. And as you can see here, it's selected. It's recorded the click. It's recorded the upload dialog, and I can just drag and drop that here, run the sequence again, and fine. That's it. That's all about upload. No more scripting, no more hassling. It just works. It even works with multiple files upload, which is not supported with QFDriver yet. And if you said, well, but I still have some Firefoxes in my test, I want to have an upload method which is working fine with both versions, you can use the QFS web input files procedure from the standard library, which is included in all tests by default. And there it switches automatically to this scripting way of uploading files in the background when you don't have a CDP connected or don't have any QFDriver connected browser running. And as well, which is not possible directly with WebDriver, there you have to specify when you want to access a protected resource, specify special URLs with some kind of user and then password or user, colon, password, at blah, blah, blah. And you don't need that with CDP. You just execute it as you would do that with QFDriver. You open this, the page. It asks for some input. Unfortunately, I forgot the correct password here, so I can show you how to enter that. So if I enter something like that here, it still says, well, that's not the correct one, but just for demo purposes, it's okay. Here you can see it selects and then, well, waits for the login dialog again because it's expecting it to be wrong. And so I could, again, drag and drop my recorded sequence to the test, and I have some tests which authenticates with the basic authentication dialog. So in fact, the great news is it works as before with the QFDriver, but on Linux, on macOS, with all browsers based on Chromium, and with current browsers you have installed. There might be some worries now because you say, well, I have a special script in my execution where I directly use the embedded Selenium driver, for example, to access some nodes. What should do? Does it work with my CDP connection? And well, the answer is, of course, no, because there is no WebDriver included. We have put WebDriver out of our communication here, so it says, well, I cannot import that stuff because there is no Selenium anymore embedded. But the good news is, in most of the times, it's really easy to transfer your script to a script which doesn't require Selenium or WebDriver protocol at all. So for example, in this case, which I got from my support team as a real-life example, someone tries to find some element with this really expressive XPath command here on the web page, which is, by the way, on our homepage. If you haven't looked at that, it's really a great homepage. There's a lot of stuff in it which is interesting for you, like videos, like training materials, and so on. And here the question is to get, for example, this green button here, and then to get some class attribute and use it somehow in your test. And most of the times, it's easy to convert a script like this to a script which doesn't rely on Selenium, but which directly uses the API from QFTest. So in this case, you can get the component of the HTML page, and then just issue a get by XPath, and in return you get a DOM API element from our QFTest API, which is like an abstraction layer over the browser's API, and you issue the same command, and then you get the answer that it's a green arrow button, which is nice, which maybe you need somehow. And there are some special cases where you say, okay, is there an option to really use the underneath CDP connection for some special command I want to execute. And yes, you can do that. We embedded the connection using the CDP4J library, which is licensed and bundled with QFTest. And you can access this, the session object, and then execute the CDP commands directly on that. Here I have an example where I get a snapshot of the DOM, but it's kind of a bad example because often when you say, okay, I want to execute that, it's a good thing to ask our support team how to do that with QFTest, because we could say for that there is already a standard function in our library, which you can call, which you get the same dump as the one here, but which also works with the QFDriver and the WebDriver connection mode, so where you are not bundled to this one connection mode anymore. So normally it shouldn't be required to access the session, the CDP session here directly. So in most of the cases, it's just a simple switch on the combo box to the new driver. When you have prefer CDP driver there, it still works with Firefox because it falls back to the WebDriver. When you have prefer WebDriver, it will inform you with a little output in the terminal that it's better to use the CDP driver. And if you have selected WebDriver only, it will inform you from next week on as well that it's better to use the CDP driver, because there is a little problem, let's say, or a security measure enforced by the Chromium developers. Probably when you have inspected your console log and you have ran a test in WebDriver mode with Chromium or MS Edge recently, you've seen this deprecation message about some request of some sub-resource. In fact, that's what I explained in the beginning. Here is the back channel. When we open some web page here, and it's not opened via HTTPS, but without the TLS, so without encryption, then Chrome forbids from the next version on, which is released, I think, next week, forbids any communication back to some local resource. And QFTest is running locally on your machine, so it's forbidding the communication back. So we cannot directly access the events in the browser anymore. So if you, for example, open an alert dialog with a JavaScript alert function, which still people do, despite it being a really weird synchronized API, which shouldn't be used with JavaScript, or if, for example, you need fast synchronization, so a faster test, then this back channel is really important. From the next version of Chrome on, we fall back to a polling sequence where we ask over this upper one all the time for new events. So it can happen that the execution of the test is running a little bit slower. But the good news is, well, switch to CDP. There, we don't have any restrictions like that. We don't need a special back channel, and we don't have to switch that up. By the way, when you follow the link, you learn how your administrator might, with some policies, re-enable this special access, so you don't get these outputs anymore and you don't get the restrictions anymore. But unfortunately, it's not possible to do that simply by issuing a flag during the start of the browser. So we decided to deprecate the WebDriver support, or the WebDriver connection mode support for Chromium-based applications or Chromium-based browsers, and instead improve our CDP connection mode with the next versions. By the way, next week there will be a new QFTest version which has even better support for CDP. So if you have any problems with the current version, just ask us for a preview of the next version, and there shouldn't be any problems anymore. But you know, there are always bugs, and it's your task and our task to find the bugs in our applications. And with QFTest, that's good to find bugs, because that's the reason why QFTest is there, to assure the quality of applications and the quality of your web pages. Having said this, thank you very much for your time and for your interest in this short webinar about the CDP connection mode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned some interesting stuff and you're now eager to start working with this new mode and to run your tests in CDP mode. If you have any problems, feel free to ask at support@qfs.de for help, and we will be there to help you out with any problems you might have. Thank you very much.